Dawn arrives differently inside the Forbidden City. The light doesn't simply break across rooftops. It reveals them in layers, each glazed yellow tile awakening one after another, thousands upon thousands catching fire in sequence until the entire complex glows like molten gold. The air is still. No birds yet. Just the sound of wooden gates settling into their frames after the night's contraction, the subtle groan of timber accepting another day's wait. Beyond the walls, Beijing stirs. Merchants, laborers, the grind of early commerce. Inside, silence reigns. This silence is not peaceful. It is constructed, deliberate, maintained at tremendous cost. It is the silence of distance made physical, of power preserved through separation. Stand at the southern entrance, the Meridian Gate, and what stretches before you is not merely a palace. It is a universe unto itself, 72 hectares of enclosed earth, 980 buildings, 8,700 rooms arranged according to cosmological principles so precise they map the heavens onto the ground. The scale overwhelms not by accident, but by intention. Every dimension, every material, every color was chosen to communicate a single truth, that the emperor was not a man but a pivot between earth and sky, and that to approach him was to journey from the profane world into something approaching the sacred. The distance from the outer gates to the Hall of Supreme Harmony measures more than 900 meters. 900 meters of marble, of courtyards so vast they could hold tens of thousands of supplicants, of stairs and balustrades carved with dragons and phoenixes, of doorways stacked within doorways, each threshold marking another degree of separation from ordinary human experience. But distance requires infrastructure. Silence demands labor. The appearance of effortless celestial order rests upon a hidden world of furnaces and cisterns, of kitchens and storerooms, of tunnels and drainage channels, of thousands upon thousands of hands performing tasks that must remain invisible to preserve the illusion of divine simplicity. The Forbidden City was designed to appear as though it had always existed, eternal and unchanging. In truth, it required constant, exhausting, sometimes brutal maintenance just to prevent it from collapsing into ruin. The man who conceived this place understood distance intimately. Zhu Di, the Yongle emperor, was born into proximity to power but not guaranteed to possess it. He was the fourth son of the Hongwu emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty, raised in the newly established capital of Nanjing, schooled in Confucian classics and military strategy. His father distributed sons across the empire as princes, each governing a strategic region, each commanding an army, each both defender of and potential threat to central authority. Zhu Di received the north, the ancient capital region, near what would become Beijing, tasked with guarding against Mongol incursions. He became a capable military commander, accustomed to campaign life, to decisiveness, to the clarity of battlefield hierarchy. When his father died in 1398, the throne passed not to any of the princes, but to Zhu Di's nephew, a young emperor who immediately began stripping his uncles of military power. Zhu Di refused. In 1399, he rebelled. The war lasted 4 years. A civil conflict that devastated provinces, burned cities, forced the young emperor to mobilize armies that proved loyal more to tradition than to the man wearing the crown. In 1402, Zhu Di's forces breached Nanjing. The imperial palace burned. The young emperor disappeared. Some accounts say suicide, others escape in disguise, still others assassination. Zhu Di took the throne, declared himself the rightful successor, and immediately faced a problem. He had seized power through violence, not succession. His legitimacy was stained. Nanjing, where the civil war had concluded, carried too many memories, too many witnesses, too much contamination. So he decided to move the capital, not simply to relocate administrative functions, but to construct from earth and timber and stone a physical manifestation of power so overwhelming that it would erase doubt, intimidate opposition, and establish through architecture what bloodshed alone could not, the appearance of celestial mandate. He chose Beijing, his old power base, close to the northern frontier, positioned to project strength toward the steppes where Mongol threats still simmered. And he ordered built not a palace, but a cosmos. The scale of the undertaking beggars comprehension even now. The planning began in 1406. Scholars and geomancers studied the site, calculating alignments with cardinal directions, ensuring the complex would face south as tradition demanded, its central axis running through what would become the heart of imperial power. Lumber came from the forests of Sichuan and Hunan, thousands of kilometers distant. Imagine the logistics: enormous nanmu trees, some over 10 meters in circumference, felled by teams using axes and handsaws, then dragged to rivers, floated downstream in rafts, transferred to canals, hauled overland when waterways ended. A single large column might require a year just to transport. Records describe teams of thousands pulling logs across ice roads in winter, channels carved deliberately and flooded so frozen surfaces could bear the weight, oxen and men straining against ropes, moving timber meter by meter across provinces. Stone came from quarries near Beijing, but not ordinary stone. The great marble ramps, each carved from a single piece, weighed over 200 tons. Moving such masses required engineering marvels. Wells dug along transport routes so that water could be poured onto roads in winter, creating ice pathways slick enough that wooden rollers and sleds could glide. Even so, each ramp required tens of thousands of laborers pulling in coordination, entire villages conscripted to supply muscle for weeks at a time, bricks numbered in the hundreds of millions. Purpose-built kilns worked continuously, consuming forests to fire clay into the specific dimensions required for walls, floors, roofing. The yellow glazed tiles that would crown every significant building were manufactured in Suzhou, their color reserved by imperial decree, each piece inspected for flaws. Records mention kilns that operated for years producing nothing but tiles, their output shipped north via the Grand Canal. Itself a hydraulic infrastructure project centuries old, constantly dredged and maintained to allow heavy barges passage. The workforce peaked at over 1 million laborers, not volunteers, conscripts. Corvée labor, the traditional system where commoners owed the emperor service, called from villages across the empire to fulfill quotas. They arrived in waves: carpenters, masons, painters, gilders, metalworkers, ordinary peasants assigned to haul and dig and lift. They lived in temporary camps outside the construction zone, fed from imperial granaries that strained to supply such numbers, worked under foremen who answered to officials who answered to the emperor's architects. Accidents were common: falls from scaffolding, crushed limbs, exhaustion. No comprehensive record of casualties survives, but fragmentary accounts mention mass burials, compensation payments to families, adjustments to labor quotas when disease swept through camps. The construction consumed 14 years. By 1420, enough of the complex stood complete that Zhu Di could declare Beijing the official capital. The Forbidden City was not finished. Work would continue for decades, adding buildings, refining details. But the essential structure existed: outer court for state ceremonies, inner court for imperial residents, walls nearly 8 meters high surrounding the entire complex, a moat 52 meters wide encircling the walls. The result was not merely impressive, it was terrifying in its totality, a built environment that declared through sheer mass and meticulous order that the man dwelling at its center was unreachable, untouchable, operating according to principles ordinary mortals could not fathom. Zhu Di spent his remaining years at the center of this isolating machine. He conducted military campaigns into Mongolia, proving his martial credentials. But he always returned to Beijing, to the palace that magnified his authority while simultaneously entombing him in protocol. The rituals multiplied. Each day began with ceremonies dictating when the emperor rose, how he dressed, what he ate, whom he saw, and in what sequence. Distance was maintained not just spatially, but temporally. Petitions passed through layers of bureaucracy before reaching the throne. Decisions flowed back through the same channels, filtered and interpreted by eunuchs and ministers. The emperor sat at the apex of a vast information pyramid, but the shape of the structure meant he received only what others deemed worthy to transmit. Power, absolute in theory, became in practice a negotiation between the man on the throne and the thousands who managed the machinery allowing him to occupy it. And that machinery was staggeringly complex. Consider heating. Beijing winters bite with fierce cold, temperatures plunging well below freezing. The Forbidden City's great halls, built for ceremony rather than comfort, were nearly impossible to heat. But the residential quarters where the emperor and his family lived required warmth. The solution was a system inherited from earlier Chinese architectural tradition, underfloor heating called kang. Channels ran beneath floors, fed by furnaces located in adjacent rooms or basements. Servants tended these furnaces constantly during winter, feeding them coal or wood, monitoring temperatures, ensuring the imperial family never experienced discomfort. The fuel consumption was enormous. Records from later periods document hundreds of thousands of kilograms of coal burned annually just to heat the inner court. This meant supply chains stretching to coal mines in the western hills, carts arriving daily, storage facilities stocked and managed, ash removed, chimneys cleaned. Water presented equal challenges. The palace required vast quantities for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and the ornamental pools and canals integrated into the design. Wells existed within the complex, dozens of them, but their capacity was insufficient for peak demand. So water was also hauled from outside, carried in by laborers who made the journey repeatedly each day, filling cisterns and reservoirs that distributed throughout the grounds. In winter, ice was harvested from frozen lakes outside Beijing, cut into blocks, transported into the city, stored in deep ice houses insulated with straw and packed earth. These ice houses, invisible to visitors walking above ground, were essential infrastructure, ensuring the imperial household could enjoy cool drinks in summer and preserve food year-round. Food itself required a supply operation of industrial scale. The imperial kitchens occupied entire compounds within the Forbidden City, staffed by hundreds of cooks, servers, tasters, provisioners. The emperor's meals, at least in theory, consisted of dozens of dishes, prepared with ingredients sourced from across the empire: seafood from coastal provinces, game from Manchuria, fruits from the south, grains and vegetables from the agricultural heartlands. Maintaining this abundance meant coordinating tribute shipments, managing storehouses, preventing spoilage, and ensuring quality control. The reality, documented in later memoirs and archival records, was often less extravagant than the ideal. Many dishes prepared for imperial banquets were symbolic, intended for display rather than consumption, their presence affirming the emperor's access to all the empire's bounty, even if he personally ate only a fraction. The human population within the walls fluctuated, but numbered in the tens of thousands during peak periods. Beyond the emperor and his immediate family, the Forbidden City housed the empress, imperial consorts, concubines selected from families across the empire, their children, and the eunuchs who served as intermediaries between the inner and outer courts. Eunuchs, castrated boys taken often from poor families, formed a parallel bureaucracy. They managed the imperial household, controlled access to the emperor, transmitted orders, and accumulated over time tremendous informal power. By their nature, as liminal figures, neither fully male nor part of the Confucian family structure, they could enter spaces forbidden to other men. This granted them intimacy with the emperor that even high ministers lacked. The eunuch population within the Forbidden City sometimes exceeded 10,000. They lived in dormitories, organized into departments responsible for everything from wardrobe management to document handling to entertainment. They cooked, they cleaned, they carried messages, they stood guard. Their presence was essential to daily operations, Yet their existence troubled Confucian scholars who viewed castration as mutilation, a violation of natural order. This tension between practical necessity and ideological discomfort permeated palace life. The very structure that elevated the emperor above ordinary humanity required vast numbers of people living in conditions defined by hierarchy, surveillance, and restricted possibility. Over generations, the Forbidden City developed its own internal logic, a set of customs and expectations that governed behavior with force equivalent to law. Silence was expected in many zones. Certain courtyards could only be crossed at specific times. Colors indicated rank: yellow for the emperor, red for high officials, blue and green for lower tiers. Even walking rhythms were prescribed, the pace at which one approached the throne, carefully calibrated to demonstrate respect without suggesting urgency. These protocols aimed to maintain distance, to prevent familiarity from eroding the mystique essential to autocratic rule. But distance came at a cost the emperors themselves bore. Zhu Di, who built this apparatus, died in 1424 during a military campaign. His successors inherited the palace and the problem, how to wield power from within a structure designed to isolate them. Some emperors embraced the seclusion, becoming virtual recluses who governed through written edicts and rarely left the inner court. Others chafed against the constraints, seeking escape through gardens, hunting trips, or simply ignoring protocol. The palace did not adapt easily. Its rhythms, once established, resisted change. Servants grew accustomed to routines. Eunuchs consolidated influence. The architecture itself reinforced patterns. Walls that protected also confined. The mid-Ming period saw the Forbidden City reach its operational zenith. Emperors conducted grand ceremonies in the outer court halls, the Hall of Supreme Harmony for coronations and major state rituals, the Hall of Central Harmony for preparatory rites, the Hall of Preserving Harmony for imperial examinations and banquets. These events mobilized thousands. Officials in formal robes arranged by rank, musicians positioned in courtyards, incense burners releasing clouds of fragrant smoke, the emperor ascending his throne to preside over spectacles designed to reaffirm cosmic and political order simultaneously. The expense was colossal. Robes alone required silk woven by specialist workshops, embroidered with dragon motifs using gold thread, each garment taking months to complete. Multiply by thousands of participants, and the textile demands alone strained resources. The operating budget drew from imperial treasuries filled by taxation, but also by monopolies on salt and other commodities, by tribute from vassal states, and increasingly by internal palace industries. The Forbidden City was not purely a consumer of resources. It attempted with mixed success to generate income. Workshops within the palace grounds produced luxury goods, porcelain, lacquerware, jade carvings, paintings. These items, ostensibly for imperial use, also entered broader circulation, gifted to officials or sold to raise funds. The line between public treasury and private imperial wealth blurred. Emperors technically owned nothing and everything simultaneously, a paradox that complicated financial management. Yet, financial pressure mounted. Maintaining the palace proved far more expensive than constructing it. Wood rotted, roofs leaked, tiles cracked, foundations settled unevenly, causing structures to list and require leveling. Every few decades, major renovation campaigns became necessary. These projects resembled the original construction in scale: timber sourced from distant forests, craftsmen recruited, scaffolding erected around halls that could not be fully vacated, because the business of empire continued regardless. Records describe emperors holding court in temporary pavilions, while carpenters rebuilt the very throne halls, symbolic of permanent authority. Fires posed an existential threat. The Forbidden City, built primarily of wood, was a vast tinderbox. Despite prohibitions on open flames in many areas, despite water reservoirs positioned strategically throughout the complex, Fires erupted repeatedly. Lightning strikes during summer storms. Accidents with heating systems in winter, sabotage suspected but rarely proven. A major fire in 1421, shortly after the palace's completion, destroyed several newly built halls, including the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Reconstruction took decades and enormous expense. Similar disasters recurred across centuries, each one consuming irreplaceable original structures and forcing their replacement with approximations that, no matter how skilled the craftsman, could never fully replicate the first vision. These crises exposed the fragility underlying the facade of permanence. The Forbidden City projected eternity, yet it aged constantly, required perpetual vigilance, and depended on economic and political stability to fund its upkeep. When that stability faltered, the palace suffered immediately. The late Ming period brought systemic strain. By the 16th century, the dynasty faced mounting challenges: frontier wars draining the treasury, factional struggles between eunuch and scholar official networks paralyzing administration, natural disasters reducing agricultural output, and thus tax revenue, and the emergence of new economic forces, global silver flows, commercial expansion that disrupted traditional fiscal models. The Forbidden City, consuming resources at rates established during prosperous eras, became increasingly difficult to maintain at expected standards. Emperors responded variably. Some attempted austerity, reducing the number of palace banquets, limiting construction projects, cutting staff. Such measures inevitably met resistance. Eunuchs, whose livelihoods depended on palace expenditures, objected. Officials argued that reducing imperial splendor undermined the dynasty's prestige. The emperor occupied a paradoxical position, absolute ruler in theory, but constrained in practice by the expectations and interests of those who sustained his power. Cutting costs meant negotiating with networks whose cooperation was essential. Other emperors ignored financial realities altogether, retreating into private pleasures funded by diverting resources from state needs to personal indulgence. The Wanli emperor, who reigned from 1572 to 1620, famously withdrew from active governance for extended periods, remaining inside the Forbidden City but refusing to hold audiences or engage with ministers. The palace functioned, after a fashion, in his absence. Routine business continued, managed by bureaucrats and eunuchs executing policies on autopilot. But the withdrawal created a vacuum, and vacuums in autocracies fill with intrigue. Factions competed for influence. Corruption flourished. The distance the architecture created between emperor and empire widened from physical separation into political disconnection. By the early 17th century, the Ming dynasty was visibly declining. Peasant uprisings erupted across provinces. Manchu forces, organized and ambitious, pressed from the northeast. The Forbidden City, magnificent and isolated, increasingly resembled a monument oblivious to its own obsolescence. In 1644, a rebel army led by Li Zicheng breached Beijing's defenses. The Chongzhen emperor, last of the Ming rulers, fled the Forbidden City under cover of darkness, climbed a hill overlooking the capital, and hanged himself from a tree. The palace he abandoned stood intact, a shell awaiting new occupants. The Manchus, who established the Qing dynasty, faced a decision. They were conquerors from beyond the traditional Chinese heartland, culturally distinct, their legitimacy questionable to many Han Chinese subjects. They could have built a new capital, asserted their difference. Instead, they chose continuity. They occupied the Forbidden City, adopting its rituals, its architecture, its symbolic vocabulary. By ruling from the same palace that Ming emperors had, the Qing claimed inheritance rather than mere conquest. The Forbidden City thus became an instrument of assimilation, a structure that shaped its occupants as much as they controlled it. The Qing emperors invested heavily in maintaining and expanding the complex. The Kangxi Emperor, who reigned from 1661 to 1722, sponsored restoration projects repairing damage from the dynastic transition. The Qianlong Emperor, ruling from 1735 to 1796, undertook massive additions, constructing new gardens, libraries, and residential quarters. He amassed an art collection of staggering scale, filling palace halls with paintings, calligraphy, jade, bronze, porcelain, treasures that served both aesthetic and political purposes. Possessing such objects demonstrated the emperor's cultural refinement and continuity with Chinese tradition, crucial for a dynasty whose ethnic origins lay outside that tradition. Yet, the same dynamics that challenged the Ming eventually afflicted the Qing. The palace consumed resources voraciously. By the 18th century, the Forbidden City's annual operating budget absorbed a significant fraction of imperial revenue. Detailed records from the Qianlong era document expenditures, salaries for thousands of eunuchs and palace women, fuel for heating, food supplies, maintenance of buildings, costs of ceremonies, and funding for the emperor's personal projects. The total reached millions of taels of silver annually, an amount that grew increasingly burdensome as the dynasty aged. Population within the palace walls fluctuated according to imperial preference and budgetary reality. At its Qing-era peak, perhaps 20,000 people lived inside. The emperor, his family, thousands of concubines and servants, eunuchs numbering in the thousands, guards, craftsmen, officials, and residents. This population required governance analogous to a small city. There were internal police forces, medical services, fire brigades, even courts to adjudicate disputes among palace residents. The Forbidden City was not just a residence or a ceremonial center. It was a self-contained society operating under unique rules. Water management illustrates the complexity. The palace's ornamental waterways, channels, and pools, designed to enhance aesthetics and provide feng shui balance, required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated, algae bloomed, drainage systems clogged. Labor teams worked year-round dredging channels, removing debris, repairing stone banks. In winter, ice had to be cleared from critical areas to prevent damage. These tasks, unglamorous and invisible to most palace inhabitants, were essential. Neglecting them risked flooding, structural damage, or the loss of water features central to the palace's designed beauty. Heating continued to challenge engineers and servants alike. The Kong systems beneath residential floors needed daily attention. Furnaces consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and obtaining sufficient coal or wood in winter became a logistical puzzle. Supply chains sometimes failed. When severe cold struck unexpectedly, reserves ran low. Palace residents, accustomed to comfort, complained. Eunuchs scrambled to procure emergency fuel shipments. These moments revealed the precariousness underlying routine luxury. A few days of supply disruption, and the imperial household faced the same cold that plagued commoners outside the walls. The 19th century brought new pressures. Western powers, technologically advanced and aggressively commercial, imposed themselves on China through treaties and wars. The Qing court, operating within the Forbidden City, struggled to comprehend and respond to challenges that didn't fit traditional frameworks. The palace's architecture, designed to communicate cosmological order and Confucian hierarchy, offered no guidance for negotiating with industrialized nation-states unimpressed by ritual. Distance, which had once protected emperors from contamination by the mundane, now isolated them from information they desperately needed. Reform-minded officials advocated modernization, railroads, telegraphs, Western-style military training, revised education systems. Conservative factions, influential within the palace, resisted changes that threatened Confucian orthodoxy and their own positions. The Forbidden City became a battleground for these competing visions, debates conducted in hushed tones within courtyards designed for timeless ceremony. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who wielded effective power for much of the late Qing period, navigated these tensions from within the palace walls. She authorized some reforms, blocked others, always calculating political survival. The distance inherent in palace life shaped her perspective. She received information filtered through layers of eunuchs and officials, each with agendas, each presenting reality according to interest. Governing from such remove, even an intelligent and determined ruler could not fully grasp the transformations underway beyond the walls. Financial strain intensified. Wars indemnities imposed by foreign powers after defeats in the Opium Wars and later conflicts drained the treasury. The Boxer Rebellion. In 1900, an anti-foreign uprising that the Qing court initially supported then disowned resulted in the occupation of Beijing by international forces. Foreign troops entered the Forbidden City, looting treasures, photographing interiors previously forbidden to outsiders. The violation shattered the palace's aura of inviolability. The court returned from exile. The Forbidden City felt diminished, its mystique compromised. Maintenance budgets shrank as funds diverted to indemnities and military expenses. Buildings fell into disrepair. Roofs leaked unaddressed. Paint faded. The contrast between the palace's symbolic importance and its physical decay grew stark. Staff reductions meant tasks went unperformed. Gardens grew wild. Courtyards accumulated debris. The machinery of distance, which required constant labor to maintain, sputtered as resources dwindled. In 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed. The last emperor, Puyi, was a child. The revolution that ended 2 millennia of imperial rule allowed him and his household to remain within the Forbidden City's inner court under an agreement negotiated during the abdication. For over a decade, a deposed emperor lived in the palace, performing rituals that no longer governed an empire, attended by eunuchs serving a role without purpose. The outer court, meanwhile, became the Palace Museum, open to the public for the first time. Ordinary citizens could purchase tickets and walk through courtyards that once meant death to enter without authorization. The distance collapsed, not through revolution's violence, but through repurposing born of financial necessity. The arrangement was surreal. Puyi's household occupied the inner residential quarters, sustained by dwindling funds, while tourists wandered the ceremonial halls, gawking at thrones and imagining emperors. The operating costs continued, though now met by a combination of Puyi's stipend and museum revenue. The palace required the same maintenance regardless of who occupied it or why. Roofs still leaked. Heating systems still needed tending. The transformation from living palace to museum didn't eliminate expenses. It merely changed who paid. In 1924, a warlord coup expelled Puyi from the Forbidden City, ending even the pretense of imperial residence. The entire complex became museum property, theoretically belonging to the Chinese people. But ownership didn't solve preservation challenges. The new Republican government, weak and fractured, lacked resources to properly maintain the site. Vandalism increased. Theft became epidemic. Eunuchs, dismissed en masse, reportedly looted objects as they left. Unscrupulous officials sold pieces from the imperial collection. An inventory conducted in the late 1920s revealed tens of thousands of items missing or damaged. World War II and the subsequent Civil War further endangered the Forbidden City. As Japanese forces advanced toward Beijing in the 1930s, curators made an agonizing decision: evacuate the most precious artifacts. Thousands of crates containing paintings, porcelain, jade, and bronzes were packed and shipped south, ultimately to Taiwan, where they remain today in the National Palace Museum. The evacuation saved masterpieces from probable destruction or looting, but it also meant the Forbidden City lost much of its collection, becoming in some sense a shell of its former self. The People's Republic, established in 1949, inherited the complex as a symbol of feudal oppression and national heritage simultaneously. Mao Zedong considered demolishing it, viewing the palace as a monument to autocracy incompatible with communist ideology. Pragmatists argued for preservation, emphasizing its cultural significance and potential as a tourist attraction. Preservation won narrowly. Yet during the Cultural Revolution, the Forbidden City faced threats from Red Guards intent on destroying remnants of old culture. Premier Zhou Enlai reportedly ordered troops to protect the site, preventing the ransacking that devastated other historical locations. Post-revolution, the Forbidden City entered a new phase: state-managed heritage site and tourist destination. The government funded basic maintenance, recognizing the complex's value for national prestige and tourism revenue. But resources remained limited. Through the 1970s and 1980s, much of the palace languished in semi-decay. Paint peeled, wooden structures warped. Modern interventions were often clumsy. Concrete repairs on ancient foundations, mismatched materials, poor craftsmanship. The palace survived, but barely, sustained by minimal budgets and overwhelmed staff. Tourism grew exponentially starting in the 1980s as China opened economically and welcomed foreign visitors. The Forbidden City became one of the nation's premier attractions, drawing millions annually. This influx generated revenue, but also inflicted damage. Foot traffic wore down historic paving stones. Crowds stressed wooden structures never designed for such use. Pickpockets and vandals operated among throngs. Managing these masses required infrastructure, ticketing systems, pathways, barriers, restrooms, security. The palace, built for isolation, now contended with the logistical challenges of accommodating tens of thousands of daily visitors. Conservation became urgent. By the early 2000s, surveys documented alarming deterioration. Termites infested wooden beams. Foundations had settled unevenly. Entire buildings risked collapse. The Palace Museum Administration, now better funded thanks to tourism revenue and government support, launched comprehensive restoration projects. These efforts aimed not merely to repair, but to recover original techniques and materials, training new generations of craftsmen in traditional joinery, tile making, and decorative arts, nearly lost during decades of neglect and ideological upheaval. Modern restoration of the Forbidden City is painstaking. A single building might take years. Craftsmen dismantle structures piece by piece, numbering components, replacing damaged elements with materials sourced to match originals. Non-mu wood, once harvested from old-growth forests, is now exceedingly rare and expensive. Alternatives must be found or salvaged timber recycled. Glazed tiles require revival of kiln techniques, chemists analyzing historical samples to replicate glaze formulas. The work combines archaeology, architecture, chemistry, and art history, demanding expertise and patience. Funding remains a constant challenge. The Palace Museum operates partly on government subsidy, partly on ticket sales, and increasingly on commercial partnerships. The museum shop sells merchandise, licensing the palace's image for products ranging from books to cosmetics. Sponsorships from corporations fund specific restoration projects in exchange for publicity. These arrangements, pragmatic and necessary, involve trade-offs. Commercialization risks diluting cultural significance, reducing a complex historical site to brand. Yet without revenue, preservation falters. The distance between ideal and reality persists. The Forbidden City survives not through admiration alone, but through continuous negotiation between heritage protection and financial viability. Staff numbers illustrate the ongoing burden. The Palace Museum employs around 2,000 people: curators, conservators, security personnel, administrators, guides, maintenance workers. This workforce, substantial by museum standards, represents a fraction of the tens of thousands who once inhabited and served the palace. Yet the physical plant remains the same size, the maintenance needs undiminished. Modern technology helps: electric lighting, climate control in exhibition halls, digital monitoring systems, but cannot eliminate the fundamental requirement. Preserving 980 buildings demands relentless, labor-intensive effort. Visitor management has become a science. The museum limits daily admissions to protect structures, yet even the cap, 80,000 visitors per day, means enormous crowds. Pathways direct traffic through the complex, but bottlenecks form at popular halls. The experience of visiting the Forbidden City today contrasts sharply with its intended purpose. Instead of silence and empty courtyards communicating imperial distance, visitors encounter throngs, selfie sticks, ambient noise. The architecture's scale still impresses, but the intimacy of space, the design progression from public to private, dissolves amid masses. Conservation priorities increasingly focus on intangible heritage, the knowledge of craftsmen, the ritual uses of spaces, the cultural meanings embedded in architectural details. The Palace Museum has established training programs, apprenticing young workers to aging masters of traditional techniques. These programs address a looming crisis. As the generation trained before the Cultural Revolution retires, skills risk vanishing. Preserving the Forbidden City means not just maintaining buildings, but sustaining the human expertise required to maintain them authentically. Digital documentation offers partial solutions. Laser scanning creates precise three-dimensional models of structures, capturing current conditions and enabling virtual restoration experiments. These models assist planning and serve as archives should disasters occur. Yet, digital surrogates cannot replace physical presence. The Forbidden City's significance resides partly in materiality, the texture of centuries-old wood, the variations in handmade tiles, the patina of age. Translating that into data preserves information, but loses essence. Climate change introduces new threats. Beijing's weather patterns are shifting, with more intense rainstorms and temperature fluctuations. The palace's drainage systems, designed for historical climate norms, struggle with extreme events. Flooding has damaged courtyards. Freeze-thaw cycles crack masonry. Adapting infrastructure without compromising historical integrity poses difficult engineering challenges. Pollution, though improved from past decades, continues degrading surfaces. Particulate matter settles on roofs and walls, accelerating weathering. Cleaning is necessary but risky. Improper techniques can damage fragile materials. Conservators test methods meticulously, balancing preservation against intervention. The question of authenticity haunts every restoration decision. When replacing rotten beams, should modern wood preservatives be used? When repairing tiles, should approximations suffice, or must exact historical methods be followed regardless of cost? These choices lack clear answers. Purists argue for maximum historical accuracy, while pragmatists prioritize structural integrity and budget constraints. Each project involves negotiating among stakeholders with differing values. Economically, the Forbidden City is both asset and liability. It generates substantial revenue through tourism, but operating costs and necessary conservation expenditures exceed income. Government subsidies fill the gap, justified by the site's national importance. Yet this dependence renders the palace vulnerable to political and economic shifts. Should priorities change, funding could diminish, compromising conservation. The palace endures at the state's pleasure, a precarious position for a heritage site of global significance. Internationally, the Forbidden City attracts scholarly attention and collaborative projects. Partnerships with foreign museums and universities bring expertise and sometimes funding. These collaborations facilitate knowledge exchange, but also raise sovereignty concerns. Who controls research narratives? How are findings shared? The palace's history as symbol of Chinese imperial power makes international engagement politically sensitive. Philosophically, the Forbidden City's present circumstances reflect transformations in how power and beauty relate. Built to embody absolute authority through isolating grandeur, it now survives by opening itself, by welcoming the very masses it was designed to exclude. The distance that once protected imperial mystique has inverted. Now, Public access and engagement justify continued preservation. Beauty that once served autocracy now serves democracy, tourism, and cultural pride. The shift is profound, the irony unmistakable. Yet core tensions remain unresolved. The palace's physical needs haven't changed. Maintaining it still requires resources, expertise, and labor at scales difficult to sustain. Modern China possesses wealth and organizational capacity the late Qing lacked, but competing demands, modernization, social welfare, environmental challenges constrain heritage budgets. The Forbidden City competes for resources with infrastructure, healthcare, education. Its survival depends on society valuing historical preservation sufficiently to prioritize funding it. Public perception matters. The Forbidden City enjoys iconic status, symbolic of Chinese civilization, featured in films and popular culture. This visibility generates goodwill and political support for conservation, but symbols can fade. Younger generations, globalized and digitally oriented, may feel less attachment to imperial history. Sustaining public investment requires continually demonstrating relevance, connecting past to present, showing why an emperor's palace matters in a communist republic. Education programs attempt this connection. The Palace Museum offers lectures, workshops, exhibitions exploring social history, art, and architecture. Efforts emphasize not just imperial grandeur, but the labor and lives sustaining it. The eunuchs, craftsmen, servants whose work made splendor possible. This reframing humanizes the palace, making it accessible beyond nationalist pride or aesthetic admiration. The Forbidden City's future trajectory is uncertain. Optimistically, continued economic growth and cultural prioritization will fund robust conservation, ensuring structural preservation and knowledge transmission for generations. Pessimistically, economic downturns, political instability, or shifting priorities could reduce support, accelerating deterioration. The palace has survived 5 centuries, but survival isn't guaranteed. Each generation must choose whether to bear the burden. Visiting today, walking through courtyards where emperors once processed and tourists now throng, the contrast between past and present seems almost unbridgeable. Yet continuities persist. The scale still overwhelms. The symmetry, the precision, the sheer accumulated effort embedded in stone and timber still communicate something beyond words. The distance the architecture created was physical, but it represented deeper separations between ruler and ruled, between ideal and reality, between the visible and the hidden. Understanding the Forbidden City requires looking beyond facades. The yellow roofs and marble balustrades, magnificent as they are, constituted the surface. Beneath and behind lay furnaces and cisterns, storerooms and kitchens, the endless labor of thousands making possible the appearance of effortless grandeur. The emperors who dwelt at the center inhabited a reality constructed by others, their absolute power dependent on intricate, fragile systems they could not fully control. The distance that elevated them also isolated them, cutting them off from direct knowledge of the empire they governed and the palace sustaining them. This dynamic, power predicated on distance, maintained through elaborate artifice, was always unstable. It required prosperity to fund the machinery, stability to sustain the hierarchy, and acceptance of the ideology justifying it all. When any component failed, the system strained. The Ming collapsed partly because the Forbidden City's distance prevented emperors from responding effectively to crises. The Qing survived longer by adapting, but ultimately faced the same problem, governing from within walls that shielded as much as they empowered. The transformation from palace to museum represents an adaptation as radical as the Qing occupation. By opening to the public, the Forbidden City found new purpose, new justification for continued existence. The survival was not failure, but evolution, recognition that beauty and historical significance could generate value differently than autocratic power. Yet the adaptation came at a cost: the loss of function, the erasure of lived experience, the conversion of sacred space into spectacle. This trajectory offers insight into how monumental architecture endures. Buildings outlive their original purposes. They persist by being repurposed, adapted, made useful in contexts their creators never imagined. The Forbidden City was built to house emperors forever. It survives by welcoming millions who would have been executed for trespassing. The irony cuts deep, but the lesson is clear. Structures claiming permanence actually achieve longevity through flexibility, through willingness, often forced to become something else. What it costs to rule by distance cannot be calculated solely in currency. Yes, the treasure expended constructing and maintaining the Forbidden City was staggering, resources that might have funded armies, irrigation projects, or famine relief. But the deeper cost was human. The emperors trapped in ritual, surrounded by beauty yet isolated from genuine connection. The thousands who labored to build the palace, conscripted from villages, separated from families, working under conditions that killed many. The servants and eunuchs whose lives were consumed serving a system that granted them survival, but little else. The officials and ministers navigating a court where proximity to power meant vulnerability to purges. The distance the palace enforced was not merely spatial, it was emotional, relational, epistemological. It separated people from truth, rulers from reality, individuals from authentic experience. And yet the Forbidden City endures, testament to human capacity for creating beauty and meaning even within systems of oppression. The craftsmen who carved stone and joined timber and painted murals were not free, but their work transcended servitude. Walking through the palace today, we encounter their legacy, skill and artistry that transformed raw materials into something that communicates across centuries. That communication is complex, not simple admiration. The beauty is real, but so is the suffering that enabled it. Both truths must be held simultaneously. The Forbidden City teaches that great achievements rest on hidden foundations, that what we admire publicly often depends on what we ignore privately. The palace worked because thousands labored invisibly. It impressed because visitors saw only curated perfection, never the furnaces or the exhaustion. Distance allowed illusion to substitute for reality, appearance to eclipse substance. In the present, that distance has collapsed. We can tour storerooms and see conservation workshops. Museums explain the labor, the logistics, the lives. Transparency replaces mystique. Yet even now, challenges remain hidden from most visitors. The budget battles, the staffing shortages, the debates over restoration philosophy, these occur off-stage, known only to specialists. The public sees result, not process. Admiration continues untroubled by full awareness of cost. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps beauty requires distance, not the autocratic kind, but the psychological space between experiencing art and understanding its production. To walk through the Forbidden City absorbed in aesthetic pleasure is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Full reckoning demands asking who built this, who maintained it, whose resources funded it, whose freedom was sacrificed, whose distance was enforced to create the silence and scale that still move us. The answer is not to reject beauty because it was born from suffering. The answer is to honor both the achievement and the cost, to recognize that the palace stands because countless people gave labor, creativity, and often their lives to realize a vision they neither conceived nor benefited from. Their contribution deserves remembrance alongside the emperors whose names history records. The Forbidden City survives today through continued effort no less demanding than original construction. Conservators, guards, administrators, guides, these modern laborers sustain the palace not for imperial power, but for collective memory. The work remains largely invisible to tourists rushing from hall to hall. Yet without it, the palace would crumble. Beauty does not maintain itself. Monuments require ongoing care, funding, expertise, and commitment. The distance between what visitors see and what sustaining it demands remains vast. Ultimately, the Forbidden City story is not primarily about emperors or architecture. It is about what sustaining beauty costs and who pays that cost. It is about power's dependence on hidden labor. It is about distance, physical, social, psychological, and the illusions distance enables. It is about adaptation and survival, about structures outliving their purposes by finding new ones. And it is about the choice every generation faces, whether to bear the burden of preserving what the past created, knowing that preservation is never simple conservation, but continuous negotiation between inheritance and transformation. The dawn that reveals yellow tiles glowing like gold each morning also reveals cracked beams, faded paint, drainage channels needing repair. Both are real. Both are the Forbidden City. Acknowledging this dual reality, beauty and burden, grandeur and fragility, is the first step toward honest stewardship. The palace does not need worshippers or critics. It needs people willing to see it whole, magnificent, yes, but also demanding, expensive, compromised, and utterly dependent on whether we choose to do the work its survival requires. If the price of preserving monumental beauty is continual effort, compromise, and the labor of countless unseen hands, who truly benefits from that preservation? Those who visit, those who work to sustain it, or those long dead who first imagined it into being?